Today we've got an exciting agenda in front of us, and before I introduce our keynote speaker, Manny, I just wanted to highlight that, the discussion on physical and cybersecurity, along with facility ratings, represent a couple of key focus areas that we have as WEC and as part of the year on our enterprise generally. The focus yesterday and that will continue today on internal controls and the strength of the program all integrates into this bigger why of what we do. We all do what we do to support reliability and security, and our programs at WEC are designed in support of that too. And so we want to understand and ensure and help coordinate that everybody is looking at this from the perspective of promoting reliability and security in the best ways that you all do, and that we know that you all do. But now let me turn to our guest speaker today that we're very fortunate to have, and really excited to introduce him. Manny assumed the role of NERC Senior Vice President and Chief Executive Officer of the Electric Information Sharing and Analysis Center, the EISAC, in January of 2020. And there he's responsible for the overall management and oversight of the EISAC, and he leads the security operations and information sharing, threat intelligence and analysis, and stakeholder engagement initiatives designed to protect critical electricity infrastructure in North America. He's also a key representative to important constituencies, including the Electricity Subsector Coordinating Council, the ESCC, other government partners, of course, and key industry groups, and he leads strategic planning initiatives for the EISAC. There's really a broad set of information sharing, and the EISAC has developed so incredibly over the years, and it continues to do so with growing acceleration under Manny's leadership. He also has a very distinguished career that spans over 4 decades, and much of that was spent with member companies. And so he certainly has a perspective that's similar to many of you in this room, serving with a utility and understanding the perspective of a utility. Most notably, he was the CIO for Con Edison in New York. He led all aspects of their information technology strategy, including any of the security issues that relate to cybersecurity. He was also the chair of the Cyber Mutual Assistance Program, and he supported the member executive committee of the industry-led ESCC that I mentioned earlier. So Manny comes with a wealth of experience. I'm really excited to hear what he says today. And Manny, I think you'd appreciate this. Before you start, I just want to ask a quick question of everybody. Do you know what a CISO's 2 greatest fears are? Everyone who works for the company and everyone who doesn't. Thanks, Manny. Welcome on board.
Well, good morning, everybody. It's great to be here with you, and I really appreciate the invitation from the WEC team to come out here and spend some time with you. And whenever I start these conversations, I always want to start by saying thank you. Regardless of what your role is in this ecosystem, you play an important role, and you're on the front lines of what we do from a reliability and security perspective. And without you, we wouldn't be as reliable and secure. And I mean that sincerely, right? I'm going to talk a lot about security today and give you, some insights into the threat landscape and what we see from the EISAC perspective. But I'm going to try to make sure that I don't go too much into the technical weeds of things. I really want to tie it back to what we do in terms of ensuring or helping to ensure the reliability and security of the bulk power system in North America. So there's the agenda. I'll go through some of this. I'll sprinkle in. I'm trying to figure out a joke that's better than Steven's yesterday, but I'll see if I can come up with one. Before I jump in, I always like to share some anecdotes to provide some context. So probably the same for you, but when it comes to security, a couple of watershed moments for me, right? So I am a New Yorker, born and raised in New York. I did work for Con Ed. I was at the Twin Towers at 9/11, right? And responded. I didn't go home that night. And you all know what took place and sort of the geopolitical, ramifications and after effects of that situation. But, as it relates to security and resiliency, it was really the beginning, not only in New York State, of our public utility commissions taking a real focus, deliberate focus on our security, our reliability, our resilience, right? And what followed was years of sort of, really starting to think this through, improving sort of our instant command and response capabilities too. So, that moment stays with me for many, many reasons. Obviously seeing something like that is quite impactful, and for the loss of life that occurred that day. But again, what cascaded after that as it relates to resilience and security, I think is important. So then fast forward to 2003. And I was sitting in a data center at Con Ed's headquarters in New York. And we were having a meeting, and the conference line goes dark. Can't hear anybody. Lights go out. So it's a 2003 blackout, right? Which is, sort of a catalyst for, what happened with the NERC SIP standards as well, too, right? How we started to modify those standards to ensure that something like that didn't happen again. So what a lot of people forget after the 2003 blackout, so I spent the night in my office that night as we recovered. Fortunately, the lights came back on the next day. 5 days later, the world was hit by the Welcha or I love you virus, right? And I don't know how many of you remember that, which shut down computer networks across the globe, right? And it really was, again, a watershed moment from a cybersecurity perspective. And, it was interesting. This was a virus that some hacker had nothing better to do and really just wanted to disrupt computer networks. There was no ransom attached to it. There was not necessarily malware. They just wanted to break things, right? And that really started the conversation about having more robust patching policies and other cyber hygiene sort of related things. So I remember after that, I swore I would patch everything and everybody, right? I didn't care. We were gonna maintain currency as it related to software, especially critical software in our environment, right? Fast forward to today, right? Where, from a physical side, we're still concerned about, the geopolitical activities. We're concerned about the activities from domestic violence extremists, but particularly from the cyber threat landscape. And in my career, and Steve mentioned, I've been doing this for a long time. I started when I was 10, by the way. I'm not that old. But the complexity of the threat landscape is unprecedented, right? It's very, very hard. And I'll go through some things to back that up. But just as recently as a vulnerability or an exploit that was perpetrated against the VMware platform. And for those of you that aren't familiar, VMware is a server virtualization technology, allows you to take a computer, a server, and cut it into chunks so you could optimize the compute. And we talk about virtualization as we go through the SIP standards as well, too. So a threat actor, and it's largely attributed to Chinese threat actors, was able to gain administrative privileges, put malware in there, and do whatever they want. Essentially travel across networks, laterally, up, down, steal data. And again, this wasn't an exploit. It wasn't a vulnerability in the VMware platform. They just took advantage, and we don't know how they did it, but they were able to steal credentials. And once you steal admin level credentials, I always say game is kind of over, right? You really have to figure out what you have to do. So, again, I share that not to scare you, but to underscore the complexity of the environment. But the other thing, if you get anything out of what I say today, and I truly believe this, having been somebody that signed off on NERC compliance and now working for NERC, this ecosystem and the standards go a long way towards protecting and ensuring the reliability and security of the bulk power system. I don't want to put my feet up and say game's over, we got it covered. No, because the threat continues to evolve, but the work that you do really makes a difference, right? And again, if you get anything out of my discussion today, I want to leave you with that. So I'm going to talk for a bit. I plan on leaving plenty of time for questions, so tee it up. I figured I'd take a step back and start with what's going on at NERC, and you know what we do. But a couple of things that we are really acutely focused on now, and in our most recent business planning and budget cycle, we really tried to make sure we were focused on this. And this is driving everything that we do, and also in terms of working with the rest of the regions. So, the grid is transforming, right? Some of it is related to climate change and extreme weather. And we have other issues like inverter performance issues, right? And I'm not picking on the solar industry at all. It's just as the grid continues to evolve, how do we continue to stay ahead of it? And we have to stay ahead of it, right? We can't necessarily take our sweet time to sort of react to things, right? Because when you wait for things to happen, there are a lot of other unintended consequences that come along. You just heard me talk about security, right? And the security landscape is incredibly complex, right? Whether it's supply chain, IT related threats, ransomware, and putting that in the context of planning the next grid is important, right? And so security, and you'll hear me say this later on in the presentation, has got to be built into our future grid systems, right? We do a pretty good job now. There is more to do, right? At NERC, we are a relatively small company, about 230 people. My boss likes to say we have some processes that are stitched together with chicken wire and chewing gum. I don't think it's that bad, but yeah, in a small company, sometimes you're not as up to date as you need to be. And let's face it, we assess compliance with standards. We have to make sure that we do the same thing, that we at least talk the talk, right? Or walk the talk, so to speak, and honor the spirit of the standards, right? So we have to have a top flight security system. We need to have robust information systems and data protection systems and things like that. And again, thinking about our processes, that they're sustainable, right? When you think about standards development, it's a great process, the fact that we collaborate with industry to sort of do this, right? But, the challenges that are facing us are, again, fast and furious. We may not necessarily have the luxury of taking the time that we take as we develop new standards, new information, protocols and things like that. So really thinking about this from an agility and sustainability perspective is really important. And, not just, really doesn't hit on everything that we do, right? It's the interaction that we do every day. It's the work with our government partners in terms of trying to help and inform policy. It is working very closely with our stakeholders, our membership, right? Or our customers, I like to say, right? They really are partners, and we have to be driven by that as well as we go forward. So, I won't drain this, but there's a lot going on, right? Obviously, the grid is transforming and modernizing. There are a lot of drivers in terms of decarbonization, electrification, the deployment of vehicles and other distributed energy resources. And, we heard about this yesterday, the cloud, right? And so I am an IT professional. I've been using the cloud. My wife would tell you I spend most of my time in the clouds, but, cloud is a useful tool, right? When applied appropriately, when applied with the appropriate security constraints and controls, right? And sort of, and I'm not saying anybody's really doing this, but we can't stick our head in the sand and say, no, we can't use the cloud, right? This is where we're going. And especially as we move towards distributed energy resources, their use of the cloud is there, right? They are on cloud platforms, right? So again, it's getting back to what I said before. How do we get ahead of this? How do we sort of implement the controls that are not punitive, that are not overly costly, and things like that? So again, we go back to the mission of ensuring the reliability and security of the bulk power system in the US and Canada. So, from a policy perspective, we're very focused on, interconnecting resources, whether they're legacy resources, including fossil fuels resources, which I think it's important. We're not going to get rid of them right away. But again, all the renewable resources, and doing this in a way that it ensures reliability and security. And regulation is not the only solution, right? And again, I can tell you, I signed off on NERC SIP compliance. I understand, the need for standards. They're an important arrow in the quiver, right? But they're not the only one, right? And again, I always like to change the conversation to what does security look like in the future in this transformed grid, right? When you think about everything being interconnected, right? There's a great article, I'll try to get this out, that McKinsey just published about the future of electrification as it relates to vehicles. And really what car companies are thinking about in terms of business opportunities, as cars, are evolving and are electrified and are self-driving, right? So how do I sell more movies? How do I get you to a restaurant? How do I do this? When you think about the security implications of that, it becomes overwhelming. So, but it's a really interesting article that tells you where, one aspect of our industry is going, right? And I said this before, if we don't start building security in, we'll be chasing our tail, right? And again, I think, the renewable industry has done a good job. They have very robust and secure policies and procedures. But, as we interconnect these assets, it's important that we think about this across, across the value chain and make sure that we do that. And then information sharing is important, right? We also understand that information sharing can be a burden at times. And by information sharing, I don't mean picking up the phone or emailing the ISAC every time you see something. That's nice. And if you do want to do that, we encourage you to do that. But particularly with this complex threat landscape is asking questions, right? What does this really mean, right? So I always like to use the statistic for those of you that follow NIST. NIST maintains the National Vulnerability Database, NVD. Last year, well, let me say it this year, 10 years ago, there were 3,000 vulnerabilities that were posted. In 2022, there were 22,000. And in 2023, we're going to get close to 25,000, right? So that's 60 vulnerabilities a day that get announced in enterprise and OT platforms. Many of them are critical, right? That is fighting a losing battle, in my opinion, right? And how do we share information in a way that says, hey, look, here's something that you really have to pay attention to. And how do we help sensitize the industry? The other thing too is sort of working, not forgetting about our other critical infrastructure sectors. And we do work closely with them. And again, we are the only sector with mandatory and enforceable standards, right? The other sectors are starting to get there. You're seeing it in the gas pipeline area, you're seeing it in water, but not necessarily in the same context that we have it, right? And not with the same level of collaboration that we have too, which I think is important. So we do provide a model, a brilliant model, as we call it, to sort of, at least start the conversation with, right? And I think that's something that we can move forward with. So now just switching to the EISAC, we are essentially a town crier. We get security information out, physical and cybersecurity information out, and what we say on an actionable and timely basis, right? It's not good if it's stale. It's not good if it's old. It's not good if I can't digest what's in there, right? And discern what I need to do. It's got to be that way. About 1,500 members, almost a little over 250 in the WEC region. Of those 1,500 members, 900 are NERC registered entities. The remaining 600 are other partners, vendors, the US government, Canadian government, things like that. We are working on increasing the saturation for all registered entities, so about 1,600 registered entities in the US and Canada. And so we want them all to be members of the ISAC, right? So if you're not a member of the ISAC, please consider it. By the way, it's free, right? It's part of your NERC assessment. And there really isn't much of a list. So you will see some outreach to sort of get more of a saturation rate as it relates to registered entities. But again, really what we're focused on is sharing information, and it's mostly us pushing it out. Analyzing, doing some curated analysis. We don't generate intelligence. We take intelligence and try to curate it, analyze it, and then get information out. And then making sure that we're engaging with our partners, right? Again, we value the feedback that we get from them. We try to curate our plans and our strategy around that, and spend a lot of time doing that. And coming out to functions like this help us do that, right? It's great to connect with you and hear some things. So again, I talked about this. We do analysis and threat hunting on various platforms. Some of you may have heard of CRISP, the Cybersecurity Risk Information Sharing Program, a program that's over 10 years old, has about 60 participants across the US. And essentially CRISP is a sensor that sits on the perimeter of your network and looks at the traffic flow, doesn't look at payload, looks at essentially protocols, and then compares that to threat intelligence that the government has. It is a unique partnership between the US Department of Defense and the national labs and the private sector here in the United States. And I'll talk about this more. We're really trying to expand and enhance the viability of CRISP, but expand participation not only across the electricity sector, but also to other critical infrastructure sectors, specifically natural gas, right? Because we see a lot of value there as well. We are a conduit to the U.S. and Canadian government as well. You know, we certainly are not your spokesperson or mouthpiece, but we are a conduit based on what we see and what we share, and vice versa. It's a bi-directional flow. You know, we can help the government in terms of what they're thinking in terms of their programs and how that applies to our membership as well. This energy threat analysis is a new concept. Essentially, we're working with the Department of Energy to have, in a classified space, analysts from the ISAC, analysts from utilities, sort of looking at the threat landscape and advising what we should do. So something that just started this year, and I'm looking forward to seeing more come out of it. I'll talk about the vendor affiliate program later. A lot of collaboration with natural gas, given our critical interdependence on natural gas. You know, natural gas is still the fuel that generates a lot of electricity, particularly in the United States. And so it's critical that we have a reliable natural gas system. It's critical for them that we have a reliable electrical system, and that goes across the critical infrastructure sectors. So, but, you know, very, you know, deliberate and purposeful, you know, engagement with the natural gas sector. We have many natural gas sector companies that are members of the ISAC. We are doing threat hunting and intelligence analysis for them. We work with our colleagues in the downstream natural gas ISAC and the oil and natural gas ISAC as well. So a lot going on there. And Stephen mentioned this, you know, we support the Electricity Subsector Council, which is unique in that, you know, of all these subsector coordinating councils, this is a CEO-led council, right? And they do drive action, and, you know, we do make sure that we are supporting them as we go forward. So getting back to the threat landscape, and here's where I'll get into some of the technical mumbo jumbo. I won't go into all the details. I'm happy to do that at another time. But just to give you more of a flavor of the things that we're seeing. So every year, the Director of National Intelligence publishes a worldwide threat assessment. And for the last, I don't know how many years, it says the same thing, or it starts off with the same thing. Russia, China, Iran, North Korea possess the capability to disrupt critical infrastructure in North America, but specifically the United States, right? And we're seeing this play out, right? It is a very complex geopolitical landscape. So if you think about what's going on in Ukraine, certainly we're watching very closely what's going on in Taiwan and the South China Sea, as well as physical threats, right? The upcoming midterm elections, right? What misinformation campaigns might be, you know, spread, what you know, domestic violence might be perpetrated, particularly against critical infrastructure, right? So these are things that we actively monitor. Don't see any credible threats yet, and hopefully it stays that way, but something that we stay on top of, right? So maybe now I can tell my joke. You know what the hacker's favorite season of the year is? Fishing season. Ouch, sorry. But you know, I say that phishing is still the predominant mechanism for injecting malware, perpetrating destructive attacks, right? And again, it's a real, you know, I'm sure you ad nauseum you hear about phishing training programs and what you need to do, but it's important, right, that we do that, right? The adversaries love to look at what have you not patched. So I talked about patching in the I Love You virus, you know, back in 2003. But, you know, some of these major exploits like log4 shell or log4j, I forget. But anyway, they are actively, and we see this, and it's particularly since the invasion of Ukraine, we have seen an uptick in cyber activity, phishing, credential harvesting, surveillance. And the surveillance is generally focused on what holes do you have, right? And again, you know, that's what the adversary, because that's what they want to take advantage. They don't want to have to do the work. They want you to do the work for them, right? Now, again, going back to what I said earlier, the controls in the NERC-CIP standards help a lot with this, particularly as it relates to sort of high assets, right? And again, we can't rest on our laurels, but it's important that we think about how we continue to improve that. And then ransomware is a huge thing, continues to be a huge thing, not getting a lot of play since the colonial pipeline attack. But we have seen significant attempts to inject ransomware, and we've seen successful attempts. Fortunately, they've not impacted any OT systems related to power delivery, but certainly the capability is there and something that we have to pay attention to. So I spoke about this, all the bad guys. China is very focused on finding vulnerabilities and exploiting it, mostly for the sake of surveillance and espionage. But going back to what the DNI report said, they have the capability to disrupt as well too. Russia, you've seen obviously as a result of the Ukraine invasion and what's going on there, the introduction of really sophisticated malware that again targets operational technology or energy delivery systems. Again, haven't seen evidence of that taking place here, but the possibility exists, and this malware is quite sophisticated as we go forward. And their threat teams are actively focused on it, and we see this quite frequently. And again, the other nation states, Iran and North Korea, a lot of scanning, again, taking advantage of vulnerabilities, and then their own sort of state-sponsored threat groups that are trying to perpetuate some bad things. I mentioned before that we're seeing these things. And again, if you had a graph, you'd see this uptick. The other thing is, where is this traffic emanating from? So what the threat actors used to do, so people would employ what's called geo-blocking. I will block all internet traffic from Russia. Well, they got pretty wise to that, and you just figured out a way to route that through a state that you weren't blocking, right? But we're seeing a significant amount of traffic coming through Ireland and the Netherlands, I'm sorry. And we believe a lot of that has to do with their privacy laws, right? And the adversary's abilities to sort of use them to their advantage. So just interesting how, the adversary looks at this and tries to do this. And again, it's not just the legacy sort of utility infrastructure. The renewable infrastructure is being actively targeted. We've seen a lot of this through the Ukraine crisis, right? Where you've seen assets being brought down in Europe, in Germany, and there are all sorts of assets, wind and solar assets as well, primarily wind. But again, and again, all this demonstrates is that, hey, we'll take whatever we can get. We'll disrupt whatever we can disrupt, right? Doesn't necessarily have to be the traditional substation in New York City or something else, right? So again, they're casting the net far and wide, and we're seeing the results of that. And then I mentioned ransomware, so I'll share with you, late last year, we saw very deliberate targeting of small and medium-sized utilities in sort of the mid-Southwest US, right? Seemed to be opportunistic for the most part. They weren't targeting specific entities, but they were getting in, right? And they were seeing what they could do, and they were successful. They actually did compromise IT systems, fortunately no OT systems. We worked with the ESCC and the Department of Energy and Department of Homeland Security to respond to those things. And we got a lot of information out, right? And again, there's a lot of information. I'm not going to bore you with this, that the ISAC puts out regarding risk mitigation, not only for OT threats, but for ransomware threats. I would encourage you to take advantage of it. And, I would encourage you to look at it also in the context of what many of you do. And you think about reliability and security. So understanding how these threats work and understanding what that means from a NERC-CIP context, I think is helpful, right? And happy to talk about that more, and you can reach out to us and we can provide some more context. On the physical side, and I think sometimes I do a bad job about this, the cyber is the sexy side, right? We talk about all these technical things and whatever. You don't have to introduce a sophisticated cyber attack. You can walk to a critical facility and just do some damage. And so the Metcalf event a few years ago in California, as well as other things that we've seen, right? So we see a lot of theft, but we do see a lot of attempts to inflict damage from ballistics, from rifles and stuff like that. A lot on drones too, drones being used increasingly for surveillance of critical infrastructure, right? And so working with the government there on how do we better track this and get information out. And, you know, drones is a double-edged sword. A lot of companies use drones, obviously, for their own surveillance and inspections and stuff like that, right? So, you know, where's the sweet spot there as well? And then I mentioned, you know, civil unrest, right? And obviously in these times, you know, we're seeing a lot of it. The polarization across the country, you know, drives some of this, and something that we're watching very closely in light of the upcoming midterm elections as well. So I mentioned earlier on, and I'll try not to get too technical about this VM exploit, right? And again, I want to foot stomp a couple of things here and then tie it back to some of the work we do from a standards perspective, right? So this was not an exploit. They stole administrator credentials. How they did that, we don't know. Probably phishing, though, is a good guess, right? And again, it facilitated very broad access, right? So, you know, what do we do about this, right? Well, the good news is, again, when you look at the SIP standards, particularly as they relate to high assets, do a pretty good job of insulating and protecting, right? I'm not saying it's foolproof, right? And it's one of the reasons I think that we have not seen exploits in the electricity sector of these things, right? So again, it sort of reinforces the need for those standards and what we do there, particularly around those high assets. But nonetheless, a sophisticated adversary can figure out, how do I obfuscate or hide my activity, and how do I get to an OT environment? There's no doubt about it when you look at this. So VM also, and this is on the EISEC portal, provided a lot of information. And actually, I want to applaud the technology industry. They've been very responsive. So even going back to the SolarWinds compromise in 2020, they've gotten the word out, right? They've been very responsive, and similarly, VMware has done that. And they've provided best practice information. And again, at the bottom of the slide, you see sort of the hardening guidelines. And again, the reason I put this here, they should look familiar to you. We isolate our networks, right? We make sure that we maintain identity and access management, right? And who gets to have access, right? We look at all the other services and we look at logs. So a lot of this is embedded in our NERC-CIP standards as well too. So again, I'm not saying we got this covered, but you know, it's good to see that what we've built provides some level of protection. And you know, one other thing I'll draw your attention to that's been developed is this guide for system operators, right? And when you go back to attacks that have taken place on OT systems, if you go to the Ukrainian attack in 2015 and 16, as well as others, how do we sort of make sure system operators are up to snuff or aware of what could be malicious activity in their network, right? Misoperations, your mouse moving magically, unexpected account privileges or escalations, unexpected remote access, right? You know, we try to control remote access, through this, but when somebody gets in, what are they doing and why are they in, right? So this guide does a great job, and it's available on the NERC website, and you have the slides in the Hoover application. You can just click into the link and get this, but this is a useful document, I think, to help guide that as well too. Okay, I am going to quickly talk about some of the events that we have going on or have had, and then I'll stop and take some questions. So, every other year we throw this party that we call GridX, right? And I participated in every GridX, the first 5 as a player, and I got to throw the party last year, right? So, and again, GridX just continues to get bigger and badder, and I start out by saying what we do at GridX is it is designed to break the grid, right? We flat out start to do that. We come up with some pretty comprehensive physical and cybersecurity scenarios that are really designed to stress and exercise our resilience and response plans. And there's been a lot of good things that have come out of every GridX. Stephen mentioned the Cyber Mutual Assistance Task Force that I worked on at EEI. That came out of a GridX. Our collaboration with natural gas and telecommunications and other critical infrastructure sectors finance, and telecom came out of GridX, right? And some of those themes keep getting repeated as we go through that. Information sharing, again, up and down. So a lot about how do we make sure that we get to our state, local, and provincial governments the information we need to get to them during a substantial crisis. You know, because they need to get back to their citizens and their stakeholders. And many of those, you know, we have overlap across those constituencies. But that comes up. So again, very valuable exercise. If you haven't participated in it, I would encourage you to do it. There are 2 flavors of GridX, what we call distributed play, which is really what you do on your own. We give you the scenario, you exercise it, you invite whoever you want, and you go through it. And then there's the executive tabletop, where we bring in CEOs from the industry, as well as CEOs from other critical infrastructure sectors, and then the government, the leaders of the Canadian and US government agencies. And again, we have some pretty tough conversations about what would we do in this sort of situation, right? So if you haven't seen the last GridX report, I'd encourage you to read it. We have already started planning for GridX 7, which will be in November of 2023. And you can see all this information there on our website. So I mentioned this vendor affiliate. One of the things that we've started to look at is a more robust sort of engagement with the technology and vendor community. So here I'm talking about original equipment manufacturers, technology vendors, key technology vendors that we leverage across the sector. And I wish I thought of this, but I didn't, I have to admit. You know, this is something that's been put in place by the other critical infrastructure ISACs, particularly the FS ISAC. And really what it is a pay-to-pay service, right? Vendors get to come in, they get to share information, they get access, but they don't get to sell, right? You know, we don't want this to be a business development, and how we police that going forward, I will admit, we'll need to start. But it's also a way of recouping some money, you know, because we have increased our budgets over the years, right? So we expect to, you know, substantially offset some of the increases that we've set by doing this. And we've actually had a really great response to this, right? You know, about 12 key vendors, and we're starting small, dipping our toe into this. 3 vendors that have already signed up, and more that we anticipate signing up before the end of the year. And what we really want to get out of this is give these vendors a platform to share their threat intelligence, their risk mitigation ideas, and many of these are vendors that you use in your own enterprises as well. So I know I went through a lot as a fast talking New Yorker that I am, but I think we have a couple of minutes for questions. So.
Excellent. Thanks, Manny. Appreciate that. Yeah, we do have a couple of questions, so happy to walk through there. Also, for everybody, we put the link to the EISAC in the chat for this session, so people can go sign up and become a member if they're not already. And maybe that leads to the first question, because somebody's asking about whether it's possible for FERC, NERC, DHS, DOE, et cetera, to centralize physical and cybersecurity with the ISAC. To them, it seems that there's overlapping expectations, which may or may not mask credible, unique holes, and is overwhelming sometimes to smaller entities.
Yeah, it's a good point, and gets back to what I said before. You know, it is information overload. We're not there yet, but look, we work closely with our partners in the U.S. federal government to try to harmonize, you know, the initiatives, right? And it's not that it's what we want. You know, we want to be supportive of their initiatives and their agenda too, right? So there's a balance to strike, right? So, you know, for example, you're probably aware of, and I probably should have mentioned this, but DHS coming up with new critical infrastructure reporting requirements, what's referred to as CIRCIA. I don't know how they come up with these acronyms, but, you know, and it's similar to what we have in NERC CIP 8, where NERC CIP 8, you're supposed to, you know, report a compromise, right, to the bulk power system or an attempted compromise. So what does this really mean? And we're working very closely with DHS and DOE to sort of put some barriers, not barriers, but some lanes around this, right? So, you know, it's consistent, right? So more to come on that. And I think that's a great point. But, you know, again, I would say if you're struggling is the wrong word. If you have questions about this, you know, especially given the amount of information that's pushed out, give us a call. We'll be happy to walk through it and see what we can answer.
Great. And next, I guess you mentioned the activity in the Southwest US. Is there some report available from NERC or the ISAC about that?
There were many postings, and there was a report. I will get that to you last year. But you know, when this went down, And so, the interesting about ransomware, when people are typically compromised by a ransomware attack, they kind of clam up. Because there are legal ramifications, there might be, enforcement ramifications, or at least that's perceived that way, right? And in many cases, the law enforcement agency that they're working with says, hey, this is an active investigation. Don't share this information yet. One of the things we've been trying to do, particularly working with the federal law enforcement investigations, is, hey, okay, we get it. We don't want to compromise, but can you give us indicators of compromise that we can get out to our membership, so the rest of us don't get, hit by a ransomware attack, right? And so that's what we did. We were able, and through the ESCC, get this information, get those indicators of compromise out. A couple of other ransomware sources, so tons of ransomware sources on CISA's site. The White House actually published some very good, simple ransomware guidance over a year ago. I'll make sure you get that. And it is essentially sort of the basic hygiene things, like, taking backups, exercising your incident response plan. Don't wait till you have a ransomware attack to figure out where you're going to get crypto, things like that. So we'll get that information as well.
Great. So there's a couple more questions here, but do you see Tempest or listening-based attacks as an emerging vector?
I'm sorry, I missed the first part.
Tempest or listening-based attacks?
Yeah, I didn't touch specifically on that. Look, the adversary is going to use whatever they think sort of the best arrow in the quiver for the situation, right? So if it's listening, Tempest as well, they will take advantage of that. And again, the biggest thing, the adversary, so here's what the adversary's done, and it's been demonstrated by the sort of the supply chain related attacks. They figured out the one-to-many. How do I attack one platform that everybody uses, and let me see where I can go? What kind of party can I have when I do this, right? So that's one thing they're doing. They're also taking advantage of vulnerabilities and exploits, right? And particularly in pervasively used platforms, like that we have throughout our enterprises as well. So if there's a big hole there, an unpatched critical vulnerability, that's a vector for them to take advantage of.
Great. Now I'm going to try to combine the next two here, but just kind of your opinions of the state of local grid security, kind of like the local cyber and physical threat for a city, and then similarly progress with respect to interacting with DER cybersecurity frameworks.
Yeah, good questions. Look, the first question is hard to answer because it varies based on the locale. I think in general, this sector has been sensitized to the cybersecurity threat for decades, right? And has done a good job trying to respond to it. And again, we're the only sector with mandatory and enforceable standards, right? That being said, there are varying degrees of sort of sophistication or competence in cybersecurity capabilities, right? So whether it's just monitoring or response or whatever, right? And as you go into smaller organizations, that becomes more acute. So again, I think our objective here is how do we help, right? How do we sort of look at, and again, I think this is where technologies like sensor technologies that look at what's going on, and that to me is sort of the holy grail of information sharing. It's sort of machine to machine, doesn't necessarily require a person to do it. But those are things that I think I would say. But in generally, I think, look, we're sensitized. CISA, after the Ukraine invasion, came up with the Shields Up acronym, and we're very supportive of that. We think we should maintain our shields up, but I would argue I don't think our shields have ever been down in about 25 years. So, we got to keep our foot on the pedal in that respect.
Great, and I think the last one we have time for here is about physical security. Obviously, things are transforming not just on the grid, but in the cyber and physical security context. And so the question specifically about countering drones, especially for those high value targets, and kind of what is the ISAC doing to help make progress on that? There's a sense that there's not a lot that utilities can do right now against drone incursions.
Well, there is stuff you can do, right? And this is where I think working with your local law enforcement and, local could be, at the local city level or at the state level, making them aware of that. Drones are supposed to be registered with the FCC. Not everybody does that. We recognize that, particularly if they're looking to do something malicious. We are involved in a pilot that is tracking. So now that, this data is available, we track drone flights, right? And it's interesting to see where they're going. And then you can also highlight, you know, when it's over critical infrastructure, why were they doing this, right? So those were things to consider. And we'll put out more information on that next year as we go forward.
Great. I guess any final comments you might have on what you're most
I didn't answer
excited-
your solar question. I just
Oh, okay.
realized a lot of engagement with the solar industry and the renewable industry, right? We want to, going back to what I said in one of the earlier slides, we want to enable the adoption and integration of these technologies, right? It's inevitable, right? We just want to make sure we do it in the right way. So we've been working very closely and actually trying to grow our membership, you know, within those communities too.
Great. Well, and I guess just appreciate the comments. And last, I was just going to ask, you know, what you're most excited about in the transforming cyber and physical landscape. Obviously, like we mentioned, the grid's transforming, but so too is how we do work with cloud or AI and virtual. Where do you see opportunity with respect to grid transformation and cyber transformation?
Look, I think the opportunity is how do we build security and prospectively, not retrospectively, right? You know, how do we enable the adoption of things that may help with climate change or reliability? So whether it's renewables, storage, technologies, whatever, right? And what's the flight plan look like, right? You know, we understand the need to you know, to get away from fossil fuels and things like that, but you're not going to flip a switch and do that. What's that plan look like so we can enable some of those targets that, you know, have been set at various state and federal levels?
Great. Well, on behalf of all of us, Manny, we appreciate you spending time with us this morning.
My pleasure.
A lot to think about. And so if you can all join me in thanking Manny, we really appreciate it.
Thank you.